Growing up in the 80s, I played my fair share of Atari games. They were fun, easy, but I vaguely remember the game Battlezone, which was this tanks arcade game, probably known for its peculiar wireframe vector graphics. But I do recall playing it when I downloaded this iOS app that included a bunch of classic Atari games. But now that game's getting reimagined thanks to the PlayStation VR in the form of Battlezone VR. There's really not a whole lot of substance to the story here in Battlezone VR. It's kind of light and it's all about the matches. But basically this is the premise. It's set in the future. This evil corporation has turned the Earth into a vast neon wasteland of nothing, and you're humanity's last hope for salvation as you pilot one of 3 different tanks called the Cobra, and you're basically just playing through matches, completing missions, and getting to the last stage. So you're looking at this overview map which shows you your location in this honeycomb-esque shape pattern. And basically when you move your unit around, it tells you what each mission is all about. And the whole point in the game is of course to successfully carry out those missions. And they include things like destroying all of your opponents in the battlefield. You could even hack a base, defend a base from waves of enemies, or even protecting a convoy. Unfortunately, there are no cutscenes to try and fill the story. You just give an objective, and the whole point is to carry out each one successfully, and that's it. When you start playing Battlezone VR, you probably think you're playing a Tron game of some kind because the graphics kind of remind you of those tank scenes or those tank chasing scenes from the first movie. It kind of pays homage to the early styling of the game, the same wireframe graphics from the 1980s original classic. But of course it's been updated and there's a ton of neon highlights that pretty much covers the landscape of the map. While the game has a unique look, there's not much variety in terms of the landscape or battlefields. They're pretty much the same with each map, so it becomes boring and stale. And it's clearly not trying to push the PS4's limits because it's not as graphically demanding as other titles we've checked out recently. At the very least though, it maintains a consistent frame rate, and in our time playing it, we rarely saw it lag or have any choppiness. Now, a lot more attention is placed into the cockpit of the tank because there's more detail thanks to all these levers and display panels that are around you, so it kind of makes you feel that you're actually in the tank. One of the nice things about the game is that it's simple to get started. There's really not a whole lot of complexity in terms of the control scheme. It utilizes the DualShock 4 controller only, and if you played any other tanks or mechs game, you're going to get acquainted very quickly with the controls. So use the left analog stick to move the tank in a specific direction, and use the right one to move the turret. You fire using the R2 button, reload using R1, and then you can switch between your weapons using the X or square buttons. And that's pretty much it. When you play the single player campaign and you defeat enemies, you collect data which can be used to purchase new weapons, increase your shields, and other stuff. You could also get the chance to purchase new tanks as well, and depending on which one you go with, they all have different attributes. There are 3 main levels. You have light, medium, and heavy. Of course, the light tanks are going to be faster, but they have weaker weapons. And on the other side, you have the heavy tanks, which are very slow moving, but pack a punch with their firepower. Battlezone VR definitely plays to its arcade styling because you are competing against opponents, whether you're destroying tanks, vehicles, and also completing other objectives. But over time, it gets repetitive, and that's the thing about the game as a whole. It just lacks depth. When you get into your first match, the VR aspect of the game is there. It's probably most prominent right there at the beginning. When you're looking around in the cockpit of the tank, you see all the displays and levers, but unfortunately, seeing that you're using only a DualShock 4 controller, that means there's no interaction with the actual levers or display panels in the cockpit. You're just controlling everything via the DualShock 4 controller. So yeah, it's nice you could look around in that cockpit, but 9-10 times when you're actually playing in a match, you're not even looking anywhere else except what's in front of you. So to that degree, I'd say the VR experience is kind of weak in comparison to some other titles out there because other games require to do a whole lot of interaction and looking around. This is very minimal, and it's basically just isolated to looking around in the cockpit. Now, even though there's consistent action with the game, I like the fact that it's never too overwhelming or jarring to the point of making me feel sick. In fact, I managed to play easily an hour of the game without having any issues at all. And for me, that's good news because I am a little bit more prone to motion sickness. But when you think about it, the game isn't really all that dynamic with its VR experience. For the most part, it's static because I'm not forced to look around in all sorts of directions with the headset. It's mainly just looking straight ahead at my turret and pointing the crosshairs on my enemies. After playing Battlezone VR, I can definitely tell that it kind of lives up to the classic gameplay and styling of the 80s arcade game. It's the type of game that you can jump right in without investing a whole lot of time trying to learn the control scheme. You pick up the DualShock 4 and you're pretty much acquainted with the control scheme, and it gets right into the action and arcade fun. However, it is $60, and that alone is pretty steep given that the VR interaction is kind of reserved and static for the most part. You have the same repetitive matches over and again. There's not really a whole lot to the storyline, and the graphics are hardly intensive. So when you factor in all those things, it definitely makes for a tougher sell, and actually it kind of pales in comparison to the experience I got with another game I checked out recently, that Riggs Mechanized Combat League, which basically swaps the tanks in for mechanized rigs, and it is also cheaper at $50. Now, the cost alone of Battlezone VR makes it a tough sell, like I said, so it's probably best to wait for a price drop before you consider buying it. There you go, and that is Battlezone VR. Like I said, it definitely lives up to the classic gameplay of its 80s arcade counterpart, but it's kind of lacking in the VR area. So if you guys want to learn more about this, you could check out our website, VRSource, your source for all kinds of reality.